Mama Kate was a proud mother when her daughter Jane got married to Charles, a hard-working and handsome man. It felt like God had answered her prayers. Mama Kate is a single mother who lost her husband many years back. She sacrificed all she had for her daughter Jane, taking her to great schools for good networking. After a few months of marriage, Jane gave birth, and as tradition demanded, Mama Kate traveled to the city to support her daughter during her recovery. It was a journey filled with excitement. She carried gifts, traditional herbs, and a mother's unspoken pride. The moment she arrived, the home buzzed with joy. The baby, wrapped in soft white cloth, rested peacefully in a cot. Charles was every bit the attentive husband, loving on both mother and child. Mama Kate couldn't help but admire him, a man who seemed like the perfect fit for her daughter. But as the days turned into weeks, something unexpected began to stir within Mama Kate, something she couldn't understand. One fateful afternoon, the house was unusually quiet. Jane had taken the baby to the clinic for a checkup, leaving Mama Kate and Charles at home. Charles, believing he was alone, decided to take a quick shower before heading to work. Mama Kate, meanwhile, was busy tidying up the house when she noticed a pile of clothes left in the bathroom. Complaining about how men never cleaned up after themselves, she pushed the door open without thinking. Time seemed to freeze. There stood Charles, naked, water dripping from his toned body. Mama Kate's eyes betrayed her, drawn to the part of him she should never have seen. Embarrassed, she quickly shut the door, her heart pounding as if she had run a mile. That night, sleep eluded Mama Kate, being a woman who had lost her husband many years ago and had lived alone for years. The image of Charles stayed in her mind, intruding on her thoughts no matter how much she prayed or scolded herself. "What is wrong with me?" she whispered in the dark, clutching her beads tightly. But the more she tried to push the thoughts away, the more they consumed her. Days turned into weeks, and Mama Kate found herself looking at Charles differently. His smile seemed warmer, his presence more magnetic. She convinced herself it was admiration, until admiration turned into longing. Mama Kate was torn. She loved her daughter dearly and respected the sanctity of her marriage. Yet, every time Charles passed by, the temptation grew stronger. She avoided his gaze, excused herself from conversations, and busied herself with chores to suppress her feelings. But the heart is stubborn. What starts as a spark can easily turn into a fire when left unchecked. One afternoon, while Jane was breastfeeding in the living room, Charles walked in, carrying groceries. Mama Kate's eyes stayed a moment too long. She felt guilty when Jane caught her staring. "Ma, are you okay?" Jane asked, her voice filled with concern. "I'm fine, just tired," Mama Kate replied hastily, avoiding eye contact. It wasn't long before Mama Kate's feelings began to manifest in subtle ways. She found excuses to be near Charles, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes and cooking his favorite meals without being asked. Charles, oblivious to her growing attraction, remained his usual kind self, treating her with the respect he would any elder. But Mama Kate saw this kindness differently. She started to imagine what life would be like if she were in Jane's place. The thought horrified her, yet it excited her at the same time. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Charles complimented the stew Mama Kate had prepared. "Ma, this is the best meal I've had in weeks," he said, smiling. Mama Kate's heart raced. "Thank you, Charles," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Jane noticed the exchange but dismissed it as harmless. She was too focused on her new role as a mother to see what was brewing right under her nose. Late one night, unable to bear the burden any longer, Mama Kate confided in her closest friend, Mama Esther, back in the village. She called her under the guise of checking in on her farm. "Mama Esther, I need your advice," she began cautiously. "What is it, sister? Is everything okay with Jane and the baby?" "It's not them, it's me," Mama Kate admitted, her voice breaking. "I've developed feelings for Charles." The line went silent for a moment. When Mama Esther finally spoke, her voice was sharp. "Mama Kate, have you lost your mind? That's your son-in-law. This is not only wrong, it's dangerous. You must put an end to these thoughts immediately." "I've tried, Mama Esther," but it's as if a spell has been cast over me. I can't stop thinking about him, Mama Kate confessed, tears streaming down her face. You must leave that house before you do something you'll regret, Mama Esther warned. But Mama Kate wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Unknown to Mama Kate, her behavior was becoming more noticeable. Jane, though exhausted from sleepless nights and endless diaper changes, began to pick up on her mother's strange mood swings. She caught her staring at Charles more than once and noticed the awkward silences that followed. Ma, are you sure everything is okay? Jane asked one evening. Yes, my child. I'm just worried about the farm, Mama Kate lied. But her daughter wasn't convinced. The tension in the house grew thick. Mama Kate knew she was walking a dangerous path, but she couldn't turn back. Her feelings had taken root, and every interaction with Charles watered them further. Mama Kate woke up with a start. The early morning light filtered through the curtains, but it did little to brighten the storm raging inside her. Her feelings for Charles were no longer just thoughts. They were consuming her. She had never felt so powerless over herself. As she walked to the kitchen, she found Charles brewing coffee. His smile was warm, but to Mama Kate, it felt like an invitation. Good morning, Ma, he said. She nodded quickly, avoiding his gaze. Good morning, Charles. He handed her a cup, and for a brief moment, their hands touched. Mama Kate's heart skipped a beat. She pulled away, pretending to stir the coffee. She hated what she was feeling but couldn't seem to stop. Jane was starting to notice the cracks in her mother's behavior. The woman who had always been her pillar of strength seemed nervous, distracted, and oddly reserved. The loving bond they once shared felt strained. One day, as she bathed the baby, she decided to probe further. Ma, are you sure you're okay here? If you're uncomfortable, we can make arrangements for you to go back to the village, Jane offered. Mama Kate shook her head quickly. No, my place is here. You just had a baby. I need to help you recover. But Jane wasn't convinced. The way her mother avoided eye contact and fumbled with her words felt off. Still, she decided to let it go, for now. The following week, Charles worked late shifts, often returning home after midnight. One such night, Mama Kate, unable to sleep, sat in the living room, knitting. She heard the sound of the front door opening and turned to see Charles stepping in. You're still awake? He asked, surprised. I couldn't sleep, she replied, her voice softer than usual. Charles sat down across from her, rubbing his feet. Work was stressful today, he sighed. Mama Kate hesitated, then walked over to him. You shouldn't carry so much burden. You're still young. Stress can destroy a man, she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Charles smiled appreciatively. Thank you, Ma. You're very kind. But the kindness in her touch stayed longer than it should have. Charles, sensing the shift, stood abruptly. I should head to bed. Good night, Ma. Mama Kate watched him leave, her heart pounding. She knew she had crossed a line, even if only in her mind. The next morning, Jane felt uneasy. Something about her husband seemed different. He was quieter, less engaged, and avoided her gaze when she asked him about his night. Charles, is everything okay? She asked while feeding the baby. Of course, he replied, forcing a smile. But deep down, Charles was unsettled. He couldn't put his finger on it. But something about his late-night interaction with Mama Kate didn't feel right. Jane decided to pay closer attention. Mama Kate, meanwhile, was worsening. She found herself dreaming about Charles at night and stealing glances at him during the day. She began dressing more carefully, wearing brighter clothes and wrapping her hair in elaborate styles. One evening, Jane caught her mother humming while preparing dinner, a rare sight since her arrival. Ma, you seem happy today, Jane said casually, watching her closely. I'm just grateful to be here with you, Mama Kate replied, avoiding her daughter's eyes. Jane felt a chill. Something was wrong, but she couldn't quite figure out what. As the days went by, Mama Kate grew bolder. One afternoon, while Jane was out shopping, she found herself alone with Charles. He was fixing a leaking pipe under the sink, his shirt off, revealing his muscular back. Mama Kate stood frozen in the doorway, torn between admiration and guilt. "Do you need any help?" she asked, her voice trembling. Charles glanced back, surprised. "No, Ma, I've got it. But thank you." She stayed a moment too long before retreating to the bedroom, her mind racing. That night, as they sat down for dinner, Jane noticed the tension in the room. Her mother avoided looking at her, and Charles seemed unusually quiet. She decided it was time to confront the issue. "Ma, is there something you need to tell me?" she asked, her tone firm. Mama Kate looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. You've been acting strange lately," Jane said, studying her mother's face. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I think we're all just tired," he interjected, trying to diffuse the situation. But Jane wasn't buying it. She resolved to dig deeper, even if it meant uncovering something she didn't want to see. Late that night, as Charles slept, Jane stayed awake, replaying the past few weeks in her mind. Every glance, every awkward silence, every strange interaction between her husband and her mother began to form a disturbing picture. She decided to test her suspicions. The next day, she left the house, pretending to go to the market. But instead of leaving, she hid outside, peeking through the window. What she saw made her stomach churn. Her mother was sitting too close to Charles on the couch, laughing at something he said. The laughter was different, soft, almost flirtatious. Jane's hands trembled as she realized the truth. Her mother was in love with her husband. Jane paced in the small corner outside her home. Her mind was wandering. How could her own mother, the woman who had raised her, betray her in such a way? She didn't want to believe what she'd just witnessed. Maybe it was harmless. Maybe she was overthinking. But deep down, Jane knew better. The laughter, the stolen glances, the awkward silences, it all made sense now. Inside the house, Mama Kate felt triumphant. Charles was responding to her presence, though subtly. She convinced herself that his occasional smiles and brief conversations were signs that he, too, felt the spark. She had no plans of stopping. Jane decided to keep quiet. For now, she needed a plan. But more importantly, she needed proof. Confronting them without solid evidence could backfire. She began watching their every move with sharp eyes, pretending everything was fine. That evening, she prepared dinner with her usual charm, chatting away with Charles and Mama Kate. She noticed her mother sneaking glances at Charles whenever he wasn't looking. Her suspicion solidified when her mother purposely dropped her spoon, and as she bent to pick it up, her gaze lingered far too long on Charles. Jane clenched her jaw but said nothing. The next day, Jane faked a severe headache and asked Charles to look after the baby while she rested. "Ma, can you help him? I trust you'll manage," she said, watching her mother's reaction closely. Mama Kate's eyes lit up. "Of course. Rest, my dear. I'll take care of everything." From her room, Jane listened carefully. She heard laughter coming from the living room, her mother's laughter, a deep, throaty sound she hadn't heard in years. Unable to stay put, she crept to the hallway and peeked through the door crack. Mama Kate was sitting too close to Charles again, while finding excuses to brush her hand against Charles's arm. Charles seemed oblivious, focusing on the baby, but Jane noticed the unease in his body language. That night, Jane couldn't sleep. She lay awake, her mind playing tricks on her. She felt betrayed, not just by her mother but by life itself. She had welcomed her into her home, trusting her with her new family. And this was the result. As dawn broke, Jane decided she needed to hear the truth from her mother's lips. But how? A confrontation might make her deny it. She needed a way to expose the truth. While cleaning the room her mother occupied, Jane's eyes fell on an old notebook peeking out from under the pillow. She hesitated but picked it up. It was her mother's diary. Jane flipped through the pages, her hands trembling as she read her mother's thoughts. "Charles is such a kind man. A strong man. It's hard not to notice him. I can't stop thinking about him. He's everything a woman could want. Jane doesn't even realize how lucky she is. His smile, his body, his strength. I know it's wrong, but I can't help myself. He's perfect." Tears streamed down Jane's face as she closed the diary. There was no doubt anymore. Her mother's feelings weren't just fleeting, they were deeply rooted. Later that evening, Jane decided to test her mother. During dinner, she casually mentioned, "Charles, remember our anniversary is next week? I think I'll buy you something special. Maybe a trip to the beach." Mama Kate's fork clattered onto her plate. Her face froze momentarily before she forced a smile. "Oh, how wonderful," she said, her voice strained. Jane's suspicions flared. She had never seen her mother so visibly affected by something so simple. That night, Jane pretended to sleep but stayed alert. Around midnight, she heard footsteps outside her door. She tiptoed to the hallway and saw her mother standing outside Charles's door, hesitating. Her heart pounded as she watched Mama Kate lift her hand to knock but then pull back. Finally, her mother turned away, retreating to her room. Jane waited until morning to confront her. "Mom, we need to talk," she said as soon as they were alone in the kitchen. "What is it?" Mama Kate asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why were you standing outside Charles's door last night?" Jane's tone was cold. Mama Kate's eyes widened, but she quickly composed herself. "I wasn't. You must be mistaken. Don't lie to me, Mom. I've seen how you look at him. I've read your diary." Mama Kate's face drained of color. "You had no right to invade my privacy," she snapped. "And you have no right to invade my marriage." Jane shot back. For a moment, silence hung thick in the air. Then Mama Kate, her voice low and trembling, said, "You don't understand. It's not something I planned. It just happened." Jane stared at her mother, disgusted. "You're leaving this house, Ma. Today." Jane wasted no time. She told Charles everything that had happened, showing him the diary for proof. His face turned pale as he read the entries. "I swear, I had no idea," he said, his voice shaking. "I know," Jane replied, "but she can't stay here anymore." Charles nodded, though he looked deeply unsettled. When Jane told her mother to leave, Mama Kate broke down in tears. "Please, forgive me. I didn't mean to hurt you. I'll stay away from Charles. Just don't send me away." But Jane's heart had hardened. "You betrayed me in the worst way possible. I can't have you here." As Mama Kate packed her belongings, she was full of regret. But beneath it all, a flicker of defiance remained. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Mama Kate left her daughter's house with tears streaming down her face, but her heart burned with resentment. The humiliation of being thrown out weighed heavily on her. But what stung more was her unquenched desire for Charles. It wasn't over. Not yet. As she walked down the dusty road toward the village outskirts, her mind raced. How dare Jane humiliate me like this? After all I've done for her. And Charles, he belongs to me. He just doesn't know it yet. Mama Kate sought refuge in the home of an old friend, Mama Agnes, a woman known for her sharp tongue and loose morals. Mama Agnes welcomed her warmly, noticing the storm in Mama Kate's eyes. "What happened?" Mama Agnes asked, pouring her a calabash of palm wine. Mama Kate hesitated before spilling everything. "Jane is ungrateful. I sacrificed everything for her, and she treated me like dirt. All because I developed feelings for Charles." Mama Agnes's eyes gleamed with mischief. "Feelings? Huh? That's no crime. But what do you plan to do now?" Mama Kate leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm not giving up. If I can't live in that house, I'll make sure Jane doesn't have peace in it either." Mama Agnes grinned. "Well, you've come to the right person. Let's think this through." Over the next few weeks, Mama Kate began her subtle campaign. Though she no longer lived with them, she found ways to infiltrate their lives. She spread rumors in the village, hinting at troubles in Jane and Charles's marriage. "She's too controlling," she whispered to one neighbor. "Charles deserves someone who truly appreciates him," she murmured to another. The gossip spread like wildfire, and soon Jane began noticing the side glances and hushed conversations whenever she went to the market. Charles, too, felt the weight of the whispers. Neighbors started dropping hints, asking if everything was okay at home. "What's going on, Jane?" he asked one evening. "Why is everyone suddenly so interested in our marriage?" Jane stiffened. "It's my mother. She's behind this." Charles sighed deeply. But why? What does she want? Jane's eyes darkened. She wants you. One evening, Charles received an unexpected visit. Mama Kate stood at the edge of the compound, her face a mask of sorrow. I need to talk to you, Charles. Please, she said softly. Charles hesitated but eventually stepped outside. You shouldn't be here, Ma, he said, keeping his distance. I know, and I'm sorry, but I needed to see you. I've been so ashamed of what happened. I just want to apologize, she said, tears glistening in her eyes. Charles's shoulders relaxed slightly. Fine. Apology accepted. Now go. But Mama Kate didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer. Charles, I never meant to cause trouble. I admire you so much. You're a good man. Strong, caring. Any woman would be lucky to have you. Charles froze, realizing where the conversation was heading. Stop this, he said firmly. But Mama Kate's voice dropped to a whisper. I know you've thought about it, Charles. I've seen the way you look at me. Charles's heart raced, his anger rising. Enough, he barked, stepping back. This is wrong. You're Jane's mother. Leave now before I do something I regret. Mama Kate's face twisted in frustration, but she turned and walked away, her mind already plotting her next move. Jane had been watching from the shadows. She saw the exchange, and though she couldn't hear their words, the body language was enough to set her blood boiling. When Charles returned inside, she confronted him. What did she want? Charles hesitated, knowing how fragile the situation was. She came to apologize. That's all. Jane's eyes narrowed. Don't lie to me, Charles. I saw the way she was standing, the way she was looking at you. Did she touch you? No. Jane, stop this. I would never betray you, Charles said, his voice rising. But Jane wasn't convinced. You need to choose, Charles. It's either me or her. If I see you talking to her again, I swear I'll leave this house with the baby. Charles was stunned. You can't be serious. Try me, Jane said, storming off. Meanwhile, Mama Kate's obsession deepened. She couldn't stop thinking about Charles, and her resentment toward Jane grew darker. She began visiting a local herbalist, hoping to find a way to bind Charles to her. The herbalist, an elderly man with a cunning smile, listened to her request. You're playing a dangerous game, Mama Kate. But if that's what you want, I'll help you, for a price. Mama Kate didn't hesitate. She handed over her jewelry and some money, desperate for a solution. The herbalist gave her a small vial of oil and instructed her to pour it into Charles's food. Once he eats this, his heart will turn toward you, he promised. Mama Kate left the herbalist's hut, clutching the vial tightly. She felt a mix of excitement and fear. The next day, Mama Kate orchestrated a chance encounter with Charles at the marketplace. She played the role of the repentant mother-in-law, offering him some freshly cooked food as a peace offering. Charles hesitated but eventually accepted it, not wanting to seem rude. That evening, he ate the meal without a second thought. Mama Kate waited anxiously in her friend's house, wondering if the potion would work. But as the hours passed, there was no sign of Charles coming to her. Frustrated, she stormed back to the herbalist's hut. It didn't work. He didn't come to me. The herbalist laughed darkly. Patience, Mama Kate. The oil works slowly but surely. His heart will turn toward you in time. Unknown to Mama Kate, Jane had been tipped off by a neighbor about her mother's visit to the herbalist. That night, she confronted Charles again, but this time with a chilling accusation. She's trying to bewitch you, Charles. She's using juju. Charles was stunned. That's absurd. Is it? Jane shot back, her voice trembling with anger. Did you eat anything from her today? Charles hesitated, then nodded. Jane's face crumpled. How could you be so careless? She's trying to destroy us. Charles stood in silence, realizing the gravity of the situation. Jane paced the room like a caged lion, her anger burning hotter with every passing moment. She couldn't believe Charles had been so naive as to eat anything from her mother. How can I trust you now? She finally blurted out, her voice sharp. I warned you, Charles. She's dangerous. Charles, though shaken, tried to keep calm. Jane, I didn't know. She said it was a peace offering. How was I supposed to refuse? Jane's eyes filled with tears. This isn't just about food, Charles. It's about you constantly giving her chances. She's obsessed with you. And now she's using witchcraft to ruin us. The accusation stung Charles, but before he could respond, their baby's cries pierced through the tense silence. Jane rushed to calm the child, her heart aching with frustration and fear. The days that followed were tense. Jane became hypervigilant, watching Charles's every move, fearing her mother's influence might already be at work. Charles, on the other hand, began feeling strange. It wasn't something he could easily explain, just a persistent unease and feeling at the edges of his mind. Mama Kate's face started flashing in his thoughts at odd moments, and it disturbed him deeply. One evening, as Charles prepared for bed, he caught himself daydreaming about Mama Kate. Horrified, he shook his head vigorously. "What is wrong with me?" he muttered under his breath. Jane noticed his restless behavior. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "I'm fine," Charles lied, avoiding her gaze. But Jane wasn't convinced. While the tension brewed in Jane and Charles's home, Mama Kate became bolder. She felt certain the herbalist potion was taking effect, even if slowly. She decided it was time to make her next move. One quiet evening, when she knew Jane would be out fetching water, Mama Kate appeared at the house. Charles, startled by her presence, tried to close the door. "Wait," she pleaded. "I just want to talk." Charles hesitated but stepped outside to avoid drawing attention from the neighbors. "You shouldn't be here," he said firmly. Mama Kate stepped closer, her voice soft and persuasive. "Charles, I know you've been feeling it too. You don't have to fight it. We're connected now." Charles's heart raced. He wanted to deny it, but the strange pull he'd been feeling made him falter. "This is wrong, Mama Kate. You're Jane's mother." Mama Kate smiled, her confidence growing. "Does love know boundaries? You're the man I've been waiting for all my life. Jane doesn't appreciate you like I do." Charles's mind screamed at him to walk away, but something held him in place. Just as Mama Kate leaned in closer, Jane appeared, balancing a pot of water on her head. She froze, her eyes narrowing at the sight of her mother and husband standing too close for comfort. "What's going on here?" Jane demanded, her voice like thunder. Charles quickly stepped back, his face pale. "It's not what you think," he stammered. Mama Kate, however, showed no sign of guilt. "I came to check on you," she said smoothly. "But Charles insisted on escorting me out." Jane's anger boiled over. "Escort you? From my house? You've gone too far, Ma." She stormed toward Mama Kate, the pot of water crashing to the ground as she dropped it. "You're not welcome here anymore. If you come near my family again, I'll expose you to the whole village." Mama Kate's expression hardened. "You think you can threaten me? Be careful, Jane. I know things about you too." Charles stepped between them. "Stop this, both of you." But the damage was done. Jane's relationship with her mother was irreparably shattered, and Charles was left grappling with guilt and confusion. Later that night, Jane confided in a close friend, Emma, about everything that had been happening. Emma listened with wide eyes, her shock evident. "You need to do something, Jane. This isn't normal. Your mother might ruin your marriage." Jane nodded. "I've tried everything, but it's like she has some kind of hold on Charles. He's been acting strange lately." Emma leaned closer. "Maybe it's not just her. What if someone else is helping her? A spiritualist or herbalist?" The suggestion sent chills down Jane's spine. "I need to find out. I can't let her destroy my family." The next day, Jane secretly followed her mother, determined to uncover the truth. She trailed Mama Kate to the herbalist's hut and watched from a distance as they spoke in hushed tones. Though she couldn't hear their conversation, the sight of her mother handing over more money confirmed her suspicions. Jane felt a surge of anger and fear. She decided it was time to confront the herbalist and put an end to whatever spell her mother was weaving. But before she could act, the herbalist's gaze turned toward her hiding spot. Their eyes met, and Jane felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "Come out," the herbalist called. Jane stepped out from the shadows, her heart pounding like a drum. She tried to keep her composure, but the herbalist's intense gaze made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight into her soul. "What are you doing here, Jane?" Mama Kate demanded, her voice trembling slightly. "I should be asking you that, Ma," Jane replied, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "What are you plotting with him? What spell have you cast on Charles?" Mama Kate scoffed, but the herbalist raised a hand to silence her. His voice was deep and commanding. "This is not the place for shouting. Come inside if you wish to speak." Reluctantly, Jane followed them into the small hut. It smelled of herbs, smoke, and something faintly metallic. The walls were adorned with charms, dried plants, and animal bones. "Now speak," the herbalist said, his eyes piercing. Jane took a deep breath, her anger giving her courage. "I know my mother has been using your charms to manipulate my husband. Whatever you've done, undo it. I won't let her destroy my family." The herbalist leaned back, a faint smirk on his lips. "Undo it? You speak as though you understand the cost of what you ask." "What cost?" Jane shot back. "She's the one paying you for this madness. Take her money and end it." Mama Kate, sensing the danger of her secret being fully exposed, intervened. "Jane, you have no idea what you're talking about. Stop embarrassing yourself and go home." But Jane stood her ground. "No, Ma. This ends now. Whatever power you think you have over Charles, I'll break it. I swear." The herbalist chuckled darkly. "Bravery is admirable, but it doesn't always lead to victory. Do you truly want to know the truth, Jane?" Jane nodded, her determination unwavering. "Tell me." The herbalist leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to fill the room. "Your mother came to me seeking power, not for herself, but to control another. She wanted to awaken desires in your husband, to turn his heart away from you. But such magic does not work without consequences." Jane felt her knees weaken. "What consequences?" "The bond she sought to create binds her to him as much as it binds him to her," the herbalist explained. "The more she pulls him toward her, the more she loses control of herself. Her obsession will consume her." Mama Kate's face paled, but she refused to back down. "You told me this would work. You said he'd love me," the herbalist continued. "And he might. But obsession is not love. You've sealed your fate, Mama Kate." Jane turned to her mother, disgusted. "How could you? You're my mother. How could you do this to me, to my family?" Mama Kate's eyes filled with tears, but there was no remorse in her voice. "You don't understand, Jane. You don't know what it's like to be lonely, to feel invisible. When I saw him, I couldn't help myself." "You disgust me," Jane spat. The herbalist watched the exchange with mild amusement before speaking again. "If you truly wish to end this, there is a way." Jane turned to him, desperate. "Tell me. I'll do whatever it takes." The herbalist's tone grew grave. "To break the bond, one must cut off the connection at its source. The charm your mother carries must be destroyed, but doing so will unleash its full power on her. She will suffer greatly." Mama Kate's face twisted in fear. "No, you can't do this, Jane. I'm your mother." "You stopped being my mother the moment you betrayed me," Jane replied coldly. The herbalist retrieved a small pouch from a shelf. "The charm is in here. Once it's burned, the spell will be undone, and Charles will be free. But you must decide, Jane. Are you willing to pay the price?" Jane hesitated, her heart torn. Despite everything, Mama Kate was still her mother. Could she truly condemn her to such suffering? As Jane grappled with her decision, Charles arrived at the hut. He had followed Jane, worried about her safety. The sight of him seemed to reignite Mama Kate's desperation. "Charles, please," she begged, reaching for him. "Don't let her do this. You know we share something special. You've felt it, haven't you?" Charles recoiled, his face a mixture of confusion and disgust. "I don't know what you've done to me, but it ends here." He turned to Jane. "Do whatever you need to do." With tears streaming down her face, Jane grabbed the pouch from the herbalist. Mama Kate screamed, moving towards her, but Charles held her back. "Jane, no, please." Mama Kate's voice was filled with panic. Jane hesitated for a brief moment before throwing the pouch into the fire. The room filled with thick smoke and a strange, unearthly wail. Mama Kate collapsed to the ground, clutching her chest as if her heart was being torn apart. When the smoke cleared, the herbalist was gone, as if he had vanished into thin air. Mama Kate lay on the floor, weak and trembling. The obsession in her eyes had faded, replaced by a hollow emptiness. Charles helped Jane to her feet, their eyes meeting in a silent understanding. "It's over," he said softly. Jane nodded, but her heart felt heavy. Despite everything, she couldn't help but mourn the mother she had lost to greed and desire. In the days that followed, Jane and Charles worked to rebuild their relationship. They moved away from the village, hoping to start fresh and leave the painful memories behind. Mama Kate, now a shadow of her former self, was left to live with the consequences of her actions. The villagers whispered about her, but no one dared approach her. Though Jane tried to forgive, the scars remained. She vowed to protect her family at all costs, knowing that love, when tainted by greed and obsession, could destroy everything in its path.